So, anyone who's followed me for a while knows that I'm very interested in the rules of sports. I love learning how they developed, evaluating new rules, and suggesting possible changes to improve our favorite sports. So, I was recently digging around the SI Vault, which is this incredible resource online. It's an archive of decades of past issues of Sports Illustrated, a bunch of great sports journalism. It's amazing they've compiled it all together. And while I was searching through it, I found this great article. It's called The Incredible Shrinking Court. And this came out of the November 3rd, 1986 issue of Sports Illustrated. And it was written by Jack McCallum, who was a great writer for Sports Illustrated for many years. So I'm going to read you this kind of subhead to the article. It says, in an era when the big man is ever more dominant, when 7-foot forwards and 6'7" guards are not uncommon, some astute students of NBA basketball believe that the players have outgrown the game. So this is going to be an article about how people in the 80s believed that the big men were too dominant, and that in the NBA just everybody was being too tall, and they actually needed to create new rules to kind of combat these super huge players that were playing in the NBA. And this is just something crazy to think about, because now in 2020, all we're talking about is small ball and spacing, and everybody needs to be able to shoot the three-pointer, and actually possibly even suggesting rule changes to try to keep the big man alive. But it's crazy to hear that back in the 80s, people were actually talking about the big men being too dominant, and that we would actually need to make some rule changes because of that fact. So this article is going to be suggesting some of these rule changes. I'm going to go through it with you guys today. This is a very long article, so I'm not going to be able to show you everything, but I will link it in the description if anyone is interested in checking out the full thing. But right before we get into it, I do want to give a little bit of context, because obviously the three-pointer is so dominant in today's game, but it really was not back in 1986. So this article was written at the beginning of the 86-87 season, and that means that we were coming off a season where teams shot just 3.3 three-pointers per game, making 0.9 per game. So the average team made not even one three-pointer per game. And as a whole, NBA players shot 28% from three, which was really low. Nowadays, teams are shooting, what even is it now? 30 three-pointers a game, and shooting them at around 36% from the field. So the state of the three-pointer, completely different than it was back then. It was still a high pace and a high scoring game back then, but again, a lot of dumping it into the big men still. A lot more free throws. It was a more physical game. Pretty different type of basketball than what we're seeing now. So I do want to start going through this article. So it says, through the years, the geometry of sports has held up pretty well. 100 yards from goal line to goal line in the NFL, 9 men on a baseball side, 22 men on a football field. But for basketball, this might not be, basketball, the dimensions might not be working anymore. It says a 7-foot player is no longer an oddity. What is an oddity is a team without a 7-footer. There were 32 7-footers in the league at this point in time. And again, this is just with 23 teams at this point, so each team with more than one, on average, 7-footer. And interesting quote here, the game was designed for players 5 feet 7 inches tall. Now we have front lines that average 7 feet tall. Something's got to give. So obviously a lot of people say that this, the increased height of all these players was an issue. Here's a quote from Detroit coach Chuck Daly. At times, the paint resembles sumo wrestling because we have so many big guys. And here we have another quote here, that the players have outgrown the court and that the court needs to grow with the players. So again, just a really interesting kind of thought process here, that the players are so big that something needs to change with the actual physical court, so it can match kind of the size of the players. So basically this article is talking about a bunch of the more radical kind of ideas being kicked around, some of the suggestions for rule changes, and we're going to get right into them. And the first one that they wanted to do, some people were interested in raising the basket, saying that dunking is too commonplace NBA big men have too easy of a time if they can just dunk the ball, drop it right into the basket from close in. And by getting rid of the dunk, by raising the basket, it would help make smaller players more skilled, get some of that smaller players to have a bigger impact on the game. Now, this is pretty crazy. They do mention here how the basket being 10 feet tall is pretty arbitrary. That's just how high the balconies were at the original gyms in Massachusetts when James Naismith created the game in 1891. So a 10-foot net was nothing that was, there wasn't a ton of thought put into it. That's just kind of how it was originally. But again, is this too low is the question. So they talk about how Fogg Allen, the Kansas coach, was experimenting with 11 and 12-foot rims. And they even talk a little bit more, as we go down here a little bit, about a game. They mentioned it somewhere, that there was a Sports Illustrated article written, here we go, in December 4th of 1967, also investigating a 12-foot basket. And I also have that article pulled up here, basically talking about some of the experiments with playing games with 11 or 12-foot high basketball hoops and how that impacts the game. So this is actually something that people, again, have been thinking about for a long time, at least since the 1930s even, which is pretty crazy. But also the article argues that this maybe it would not be the greatest idea because even if the dunk decreases in frequency, the higher rims would make it harder to shoot for all players, especially some of the shorter players. So overall field goal percentages would go down, rebounds would go up, and all we would have would be these big players getting a lot of rebounds, and instead of dunking, they would have to take these awkward shots at a rim super high up in the air. So, maybe this is not the best idea, but it was still something that people were thinking about. And here we see Jack McCallum's conclusion: do not raise the basket. So that maybe was not the best proposal at the time. But another interesting one was to increase the size of the court. And this one talking about how a bigger court would open up the game and make the quicker, smaller man more valuable. So George Karl, who was still an NBA coach even back then, in the 80s, and he was a coach up until relatively recently, into the 2010s, said when you make the court longer, you give the guard and a ball handler a little more time to have an open court and create a 2-on-2 or 3-on-2. Fans like that. So another legendary coach, Don Nelson, also, and he's someone apparently who had 3 7-footers on his team at the same time, but still wanted to extend the court from 94 by 50 to 100 by 52, saying that this would lead to increased fast breaks. And again, it makes sense if the court's bigger, more space for the players to open up, more interesting fast breaks, more athleticism, more room for the smaller player when switched onto a big to kind of, dance around and use some of that exciting athleticism, bring that into the game. I think it's really funny that one of the biggest problems people say with this idea was called the Jack Nicholson dilemma. And this is something we talk about even in the NBA today when we talk about some people wanting to make the court larger, is that it would have stadiums would have to be redesigned because this would take away a lot of the courtside seats that generate a ton of revenue. So this would basically require all the NBA arenas to kind of reshape their seats. They don't want to lose the courtside seats, and I think it's funny that the money in that was such a big deal even back in the 80s. But McCallum, in favor of this one, says to institute the Nelson proposal, so to extend it to, 100 by 52, so adding 6 feet on to the length and 2 feet onto the width. And that would actually be interesting to pair with another idea to extend out the three-point line. If you were able to extend the three-point line to 23'9" even in the corners, or maybe even up to 25 feet, if you extend the width of the court to 52 feet, that could actually work, and without entirely eliminating the corner from the game. So that's kind of an interesting idea. Another idea which is interesting is to widen the 3-second lane. And now this is crazy because, again, one of the bigger ideas for bringing the big man back into the NBA game today is to make the 3-second lane more narrow again, closer to how it was, in the past, in those kind of Chamberlain, Bill Mycan kind of eras. But this proposal was to widen the lane to force bigs to play, once again, even further outside of the paint, to be even farther away from the basket when they do their catches, and when they're working in the post, make it more difficult for them to get close, easy looks. This was something that, again, people were talking about. I love this quote from Daryl Dawkins where he says, if you widen it, that just means I'd have to jump further to get in and out. But they were talking about, obviously this has already been done before. The international game had a wider lane at this point in time. They do not anymore, but this is something that they were potentially looking at. I like this. They say it's an aesthetic problem because it looks international. It's kind of an interesting kind of perspective on the game now that the NBA has embraced all this influx of international talent. But McCallum again here says widen the lane by at least 2 and perhaps 4 feet, and widen the court also so the space outside the paint isn't reduced. So it's still kind of proportional, but we still have a widened lane. This is absolutely nothing that would be seen in today's NBA. If anything, we're going backwards on this one. And then the final proposal, which is the craziest one by far, play with 4-man teams. Can you believe it? In the 1980s, there were some prominent basketball minds that were proponents of a 4-on-4 game, with the premise being taking 2 men off the floor would speed up the game and make centers less dominant. Now, obviously, this is true. Again, it's more of a spacing thing, give guys more room to work. Again, 4 men on the court. Bigs would have to, defend outside more spacing, more athleticism. Certainly one way to go with the game, but it's a crazy proposal in general. Mike Mitchell says he wouldn't be against having 6, which is interesting because apparently the article brings this up, that girls basketball in Iowa was played at this point in time in 6-on-6, which is crazy. I actually did some research on this, and until 1993, girls high school basketball in Iowa was a 6-on-6 game. Pretty ridiculous to even think about that existing at one point in time. Again, we see an interesting quote here somewhere from Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, where he basically says he has some support from the idea. I can't really find it at the moment. But again, and it's also mentioned in here that this would actually be a ploy for NBA teams to save money on salaries with a 4-on-4 game having reduced roster size. I also thought that was kind of interesting. So a 4-on-4 game was another proposal to kind of, again, people were talking about all these 7-footers on the floor. There just was not enough space. So to actually reduce the amount of players on the floor and have, a different, it'd be a different game completely, but it would be a game where there would be much more open space. So Abdul-Jabbar, here's the quote from him. He said, you'd still get the dynamics of the interplay between the positions, but it would be less crowded and probably easier to officiate. These are also, true points, but, just crazy to think about a 4-on-4 basketball game. I love this quote from Alvin Adams. He says, maybe by the year 2000, we'll have a 4-man game. That sounds far away, but it really isn't. And I think it's funny, they say it might be a experimental something or other to do in the Summer League or the CBA. I think that's referring to the Continental Basketball Association. But again, I thought this article was really funny since we are, talking in today's NBA about all the players kind of morphing into the same 6'7", athletic wing player that shoots threes. The big man is dying. We need to find ways to revive the big man, bring him back. But here in the 1980s, we were doing the exact opposite. We were still trying to find ways to bring the littler guys back into the game and to try to bring it back into a point where, again, smaller players could be more valuable, since at this point in time, it felt like everybody on the floor was just a huge basketball player. Actually, in the 35-ish years since this article's been written, the actual height of the average NBA player has stayed pretty much the same. Now it's 6'6". Back then it was 6'7". Players a little heavier now than they were back then. Interesting, I guess a lot more muscle. But here we go. The Radicals were saying, open up the court and let the game breathe. And I will now close on what I think is the funniest part of this article, which is incredible. I need to show you. Now, reminder, this article was written at the beginning of what would be Michael Jordan's 3rd season. So apparently in the original layout of this article, it came with an image of Michael Jordan. And the caption of this image, if you are ready for this, Jordan may be the game's brightest star, but without a big man, he has no shot at a title. Unbelievable that this is how people used to think in 1986. But there we have it. People thought Jordan would never be able to win a title without a big man, as the big men were so dominant. Of course, Jordan goes on to win 6 titles and is thought by the majority of basketball fans to be the greatest player of all time. Absolutely nuts stuff. This was such a fun article for me to find, just completely on a whim. The Incredible Shrinking Court by Jack McCallum from 1986. Again, I will throw this in the description. Crazy article, and I, of course, recommend searching your way through the SI Vault for so many great, crazy pieces of sports journalism from over the years. I've been Connor Grohl, as always. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, comment, all the good stuff. Tune in for more great sports content. I'll also link all my socials and my Medium, where I do most of my sports writing there. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoyed the article. Crazy to think about how people used to think about basketball. And I will see you next time.